Statism rests on a massive failure of imagination. The statist can't seem to imagine the possibility that there could be peaceful cooperation except beneath the threatening sword of Leviathan. This failure of imagination lies at the root of all of the disagreements between the statist and the anarchist. So, where the statist sees dutiful public servants, the anarchist sees thugs with guns. Where the statist sees the will of the people being enacted, the anarchist sees the repeated victory of the power elite. Where the statist sees informed consent, the anarchist, by contrast, sees unreflective acquiescence. There's a fundamental difference of vision here. Where the statist sees inevitability, the anarchist sees injustice. And where the statist sees citizens, the anarchist sees slaves. Often, the statist and the anarchist profess to see the same things, but they fundamentally view those things in different ways. It's that shift in vision, more than anything else, that we're trying to help you accomplish in this class. Let's think a little about the analogy with slavery. That analogy is at the root of what is perhaps the single most basic, gut-level argument for anarchism. The argument's very simple. It says slavery is wrong. That's premise one. Premise two, subjection to the state is like slavery in relevant respects. And three, therefore, it follows subjection to the state is wrong. So if you object to slavery, then you also have good reason to object to subjection to the state. Now, if you think of slavery in terms of the slave master or overseer holding a gun to the slave's head at all times and directing every single aspect of the slave's life and beating the slave constantly, and clearly there are many slave environments that are just like that. If you think of that, the analogy between slavery and subjection to the state will seem wildly overstated. But if you understand the basic objection to slavery instead to be that one person purports to own another person, that one person purports to have the right to control every aspect of another person's life, even if that right isn't always exercised, then you begin to see the connection more clearly between statism and slavery. For the state claims precisely to have the right to control people's lives, to control their property, to regulate their activities, to suppress their speech. So it's easy to see, when you begin to reflect on the way the state behaves, why this fundamental point, this fundamental connection with slavery, should lie at the root of anarchist objections to the state. There's something deeply troubling about the state's claim of ultimately unlimited authority over people. Now, of course, we find, for instance, we'll find constitutionalists in the United States saying, well, but the federal government is a government of limited powers. But number one, the powers are limited by the government itself, courtesy of the Constitution. There's nothing that says that the federal government can't alter the Constitution in a way that allows it to exercise authoritarian control over people's lives. Think about the way in which, for instance, the 18th Amendment was passed, allowing suddenly the federal government to get involved in the business of regulating the production and sale of alcohol. But there's also the fact that the federal government isn't the only government that people have to confront. And the federal government has, through the Supreme Court, repeatedly acknowledged that state governments and municipal governments that are seen in U.S. law as creatures of those state governments are perfectly able to exercise what's called the police power, which is a pretty much open-ended, broad-ranging authority to regulate people's lives in all kinds of ways. Meaningful challenges to state police power, which doesn't just have to do with cops, but with the general capacity to regulate The police power is almost never successfully challenged in federal courts. I'm not saying it never is, but very frequently it's not, unless the regulation has something to do very specifically with a favored interest like free speech, and even then, not always. We can think, for instance, about a case that just happened in Los Angeles a few days ago as I record this lecture. A guy spent a weekend in jail and confronted a $1 million bail requirement after he put a poster on the side of a building, an 8-story high poster. This was rejected by the city of Los Angeles as a violation of the city's sign ordinance, and it led to his imprisonment and to the requirement that he take it down. An imprisonment, as I say, with an enormous bail requirement. That's the police power at work. And it's, I think, good evidence that the state really does claim pretty much absolute authority over your life. So the analogy with slavery is certainly the fundamental analogy at the root of anarchist objections to the state. And we can cash that objection in terms of the fundamental recognition that there is, this is Roderick Long's phrase, equality of authority among persons. So the idea is that nobody starts out with more authority than anybody else. And so to explain the kind of authority that the state purports to have, you've got to appeal in some way to consent. Because if my authority is no greater than yours, if you're going to have more authority than I do, it must be because I let you. And yet, of course, the real arguments that purport to show that the state has the benefit of the consent of the governed, those arguments just, in general, aren't there. They don't work. The fact, then, is that the state lacks legitimacy. It doesn't really rest on people's consent. We can talk about all kinds of reasons why that's so. The fact is, most people don't consent, and all the arguments designed to show that they tacitly consent by remaining within the state's borders or voting, these are silly arguments. They don't work. They're unpersuasive. The state lacks legitimacy. But we can also offer additional arguments for anarchism. We can also note that the state is fundamentally destructive. The state does all kinds of bad things. When the capacity to monopolize force, to monopolize judgments about legal rights, is vested in some entity, and that's what a state is. It's a monopoly entity that exercises sole control over the use of force and over the adjudication of legal rights. When there's a monopoly, you can expect the monopoly to be inefficient. You can expect it to behave in unchecked fashion. And that's precisely what the state does. In particular, we think about the ways in which states make war. They mobilize resources by exacting tribute from people and then use those resources to fund war efforts that are terribly destructive at home and abroad. And certainly the U.S. experience is a particularly striking example of this right now. If we think about the enormous debt that is being racked up even as we speak, courtesy of a two-front Middle Eastern war. States are terribly destructive abroad. They do destructive things at home. They serve privileged, politically favored interests and snatch wealth from the productive members of society and transfer them to the political class and its cronies. This is a key insight of a properly libertarian class theory, right? Some people suppose that talk about classes is unique to Marxists and Marxist sympathizers. But the fact is that anarchists and classical liberals alike were talking about class well before Marx was, and indeed Marx himself acknowledged that he was dependent on their analysis. We can see this played out in the work, for instance, of the great sociologist Franz Oppenheimer in his book, The